What could possibly be more dreadful than death itself? That haunting question lingered like a shadow over the Parthenon, beneath its towering marble columns that proclaimed the glory of Athens to the world. Here, in the year 399 BCE, the same year the philosopher Socrates would drink his final cup of hemlock, the answer revealed itself in its darkest form. The rising sun stretched long beams of light across the agora, illuminating the swelling crowd. People gathered with faces twisted between fascination and fury, drawn not only by curiosity but by the belief they were about to witness justice unfold. Yet this was no ordinary day of judgment, no mere execution carried out with the swiftness of a blade or poison. What awaited the condemned was something far more sinister, an ordeal meant not simply to end a life but to annihilate the very essence of a human being. It was the destruction of memory, dignity, and personhood itself, a living death that left no trace behind but whispers in the dark. The Greeks gave this unspeakable fate a name, atimia. It meant more than punishment, it meant obliteration. Where other cultures might kill a criminal to remove them from the community, the Athenians had refined a punishment infinitely crueler. They turned shame into a weapon sharper than steel, wielding dishonor as a tool of control and annihilation. For women, already bound by the iron chains of patriarchy, this punishment carried a horror beyond comprehension. To suffer atimia was not only to lose life's comforts, it was to have one's soul torn apart thread by thread until nothing remained but a hollow example, a warning to others. The victim's name would be erased, her memory extinguished, and her existence reduced to a story muttered in hushed voices long after she was gone. Executioners themselves were said to shudder at the cruelty of it. To grasp the enormity of such punishments, one must first step into the suffocating reality of a woman's life in ancient Athens. These were the very same halls where democracy was born, where citizens debated questions of justice and virtue, and yet half the population lived without a voice. Women had no standing before the law. They were not considered citizens, not even fully human in the legal sense, they were property. From the moment of birth until the moment of death, a woman passed from one guardian to another. First her father ruled her life, then her husband, and eventually, should she outlive him, her son. At no point did she belong to herself. She could not appear in court, could not inherit wealth, could not even step beyond the threshold of her home without the permission of a man. Her world was a narrow prison, gilded for some, harsher for others, but always confined. Greek society rested upon the notion of time, honor, a sacred pillar that upheld family and city alike. But honor belonged exclusively to men. Women reflected that honor, like polished mirrors, and when the mirror cracked, when they transgressed, the consequences were merciless. To bring shame upon a household was to unleash a force the Greeks called iskros. Shame was not mere embarrassment, it was contamination. The polluted carried miasma, a spiritual disease that threatened not only the individual but the entire community. The fear of this pollution was so powerful that elaborate rituals of purification were required to cleanse it. If cleansing failed, the shamed person was cast out entirely, erased from the body of the polis. Shame was not a private emotion, it was a weapon of society, a method of control, a punishment more lasting than exile or even death. This web of oppression was complicated further by class. A citizen woman, though bound by restrictions, held a different position than a metic, a foreign resident. And both occupied a different rung than the countless enslaved women whose lives were considered mere commodities. Yet in matters of transgression, all women shared the same vulnerability. Female dishonor was seen as uniquely dangerous, a threat that could unravel the very fabric of Athenian order. Public spectacle reinforced this hierarchy. Punishments were not carried out behind closed doors but paraded before the eyes of the city. Justice was theater, meant to instruct and to terrify. Crowds gathered to watch, not only for entertainment, but to witness the boundaries of society being enforced. Each act of humiliation etched the lesson deeper: this is what happens when order is challenged. In this crucible of belief, the Greeks forged punishments that went beyond blood and pain. They conceived of penalties that destroyed identity itself, stripping flesh and spirit alike. In a society where women veiled themselves, where a glimpse of an ankle could provoke scandal, the forced exposure of a body was more than indecency, it was annihilation. Public nudity, imposed as punishment, was not simply physical, it was the ultimate violation of dignity, a symbolic unmaking of the self before an unflinching audience. The Greeks created a paradox so profound in its cruelty that it revealed the sharpest edges of their society's contempt for women. In Athens, the male body was celebrated, displayed proudly in gymnasiums, immortalized in marble, exalted in the arena as the pinnacle of beauty, discipline, and civic virtue. But for women, nudity was transformed into a weapon. The very thing praised in men became, for women, the cornerstone of the most devastating punishment the polis could imagine. They called it Apotympanismos, a word that carried the chill of a whispered death sentence. Yet this was not death in its simple, merciful form. It was a ritual of annihilation, a slow unraveling of body and soul designed to last days, perhaps longer. The victim was not only executed but paraded as a living spectacle of dishonor. The ordeal began in the most public of spaces, the agora, the heart of civic life, or at crowded crossroads where hundreds of eyes could gather. The condemned woman was dragged forward, stripped of the garments that defined her modesty and protection. Every thread of clothing was torn away until nothing remained but her vulnerability, exposed before the jeering multitude. But disrobing was merely the first step. She was then bound to wooden beams, wheels, or other contraptions crafted with cruel ingenuity. Plutarch and later sources describe devices designed not only to immobilize but to display the body at every angle, ensuring that her suffering was visible to all. Strapped to these frames, she became an unwilling exhibit, left to the heat of the Mediterranean sun by day and the bone-deep chill of night. Food, water, and shelter were denied. As the hours turned to days, physical torment was compounded by the psychological wound of being reduced to an object of mockery. For the Greeks, the crowd was never passive. They were participants. Citizens hurled not only insults but stones, dirt, and refuse, each gesture reaffirming her exclusion from society. Children were led to watch, their young minds shaped by the spectacle, learning through cruelty the consequences of defiance. In this way, the punishment reached beyond the individual, embedding itself into the cultural memory of the next generation. The punishment's cruelty did not end with the body. The Greeks attached deep religious significance to burial. To be denied proper rites was to condemn a soul to eternal wandering, cut off from the peace of the afterlife. Victims of Apotympanismos often suffered this additional spiritual erasure. Their names were not spoken, their remains left unburied, their souls condemned to roam restlessly. For a culture so bound by ritual purity, this fate was a horror that transcended death itself. Women bore this weight more heavily than men. A male citizen might face Apotympanismos for treason, political rebellion, or sacrilege. But for a woman, the list of potential charges was longer and more insidious: adultery, alleged poisoning, defiance of authority. In a world that demanded women remain veiled, silent, and hidden, their ultimate punishment was exposure, a stripping away of modesty in its most brutal form, leaving them helpless under the gaze of thousands. The cruelty lay not only in pain but in erasure. The punishment was designed to obliterate identity, to make the victim vanish from history itself. We know this because in the fragmentary records, women's names are often deliberately scratched away, leaving only blank spaces where a life once was. One rare glimpse into this horror contrasts two fates. The famous Hetaira Phryne, accused of impiety, famously escaped this punishment. Legend says her defender tore away her garments before the jury, revealing her beauty as proof of divine favor, persuading the court that such perfection could not be guilty of sacrilege. Her story survived because she was spared. But countless others were not. In the Theban archives, historians found the case of a woman accused of poisoning her husband's business rival. Her name had been so meticulously erased that even modern scholars cannot reconstruct it. Only the outline of her crime remains, a faint shadow of a life obliterated. Unlike Phryne, her body and memory were consumed by Apotympanismos. Her story was not preserved as triumph or tragedy, but as nothingness, as silence. Thus, the punishment was not simply execution, it was obliteration. Not just of flesh, but of memory, honor, and lineage. In this way, Apotympanismos became the ultimate terror of Athenian society, a punishment that reached beyond the grave, ensuring that the victim ceased to exist not only in the world of the living but in the eternal remembrance of history. Among the scattered papyrus fragments from Oxyrhynchus lies evidence of punishments that chills the imagination even today. One such record, written in the dry, clinical tone of local administration, recounts the final days of a woman condemned under the charge of poisoning. The accusation was formalized at dawn, brought not by strangers but by her own brother-in-law before the magistrate. As was the custom in Athens and across much of Greece, she was allowed no voice in her own defense. Women had no standing in court, and her silence was not choice but law. What followed could scarcely be called a trial. Male relatives, city elders, and appointed officials reviewed the accusation, not through impartial judgment but through the prism of her gender and the preservation of male honor. The verdict, delivered with ceremonial solemnity, was already inevitable: Apotympanismos. She would not simply be executed, she would be displayed as a warning to every woman who might imagine stepping beyond the boundaries assigned to her. The journey to the site of punishment was itself a ritualized humiliation. Forced to march along the busiest streets, she was stripped of dignity step by step before the final act of degradation. Crowds lined the road, turning her suffering into an open-air theater. Some hurled insults, others spat, while children skipped alongside, laughing as though at a festival. Their laughter mingled with her sobs, producing a sound more cruel than any blade. To the Greeks, this processional shame was as important as the punishment itself. It transformed one woman's suffering into a civic lesson. Xenophon and later chroniclers described such grim parades as social events. Vendors sold bread, olives, and wine to onlookers who gathered not just to watch but to partake in the spectacle. Families came together to witness the ritual destruction of a fellow human, their daily business interwoven with scenes of brutality. For the city, this was not chaos but order, ritual violence carefully shaped to remind every citizen of the invisible lines they must never cross. The machinery of justice in this patriarchal world did not punish the crime alone, it punished the condition of being a woman. Her guilt was compounded by her inability to defend herself, her fate sealed before a word was spoken. In such a society, law was less about truth and more about reinforcing hierarchy. The spiritual consequences extended beyond the condemned. In Greek thought, crime created miasma, a pollution that clung not only to the guilty but to their entire household. Her family's name was stained. Children born of her line carried the shadow of shame, often excluded from priesthoods, from political assemblies, or even from marriage into respectable households. The dishonor lingered like an inherited curse, persisting across generations. Witnesses, too, bore their share of the burden. Contemporary writers suggest that those forced to watch carried psychological scars long after. Yet the Greeks intended this. The trauma of seeing such extreme degradation was designed to sear itself into memory, ensuring that no one could forget the lesson. What modern minds might recognize as collective trauma, the ancients regarded as moral instruction. The entire spectacle functioned as mass conditioning. The humiliation of one woman reinforced the structure of society, reminding men of their authority and women of their fragility. To watch was to participate, and participation bound the community together in the shared ritual of exclusion. It was a cruel calculus, social unity achieved at the price of human dignity. Even more chilling was the way these punishments were orchestrated. They were not spontaneous eruptions of mob fury. They were performances, planned, scheduled, and structured with precision. The Greeks knew the value of spectacle, and they turned executions into civic theater. Profit, too, was extracted. Crowds drew vendors, vendors drew commerce, and the destruction of one life became a small economic engine for the city. The stage itself mattered. Execution sites were chosen with symbolic care: market squares, busy crossroads, or temple steps where gods and men alike could witness the act. Archaeological excavations in Athens and Sparta reveal raised platforms near public spaces, structures that may have been designed to maximize visibility. These stages ensured that the condemned could be seen by hundreds, even thousands, turning punishment into a shared experience for the polis. Thus the efficiency of the system was twofold: psychological terror reinforced by economic gain. Each punishment was both a ritual cleansing of society and a profitable event, a reminder that cruelty and order were bound together in the fabric of Greek justice. Public executions in ancient Greece were not only spectacles of punishment, they became bustling markets of cruelty. Around the sites of Apotympanismos, vendors set up their stalls, selling bread, olives, cups of watered wine, and even small trinkets designed to be hurled at the condemned. What should have been a place of solemnity transformed into a carnival of violence. Local magistrates, ever pragmatic, collected fees from these vendors. In this way, the suffering of one became profitable for many. Each punishment turned into a source of revenue, a perverse incentive for civic leaders to schedule more such events. The wheels of commerce spun, greased not by trade alone but by the tears of the condemned. Participation was not merely allowed, it was mandated through social expectation. Citizens were urged to take part, to throw stones or scraps of refuse at the helpless victim. To join in was considered an affirmation of loyalty to the polis, proof of being a responsible member of society. To abstain, to show pity, was to risk suspicion. Compassion was interpreted as weakness, or worse, quiet rebellion against the order of the city. In this way, ordinary Athenians became collaborators in the machinery of destruction, drawn into rituals that blurred the boundary between justice and cruelty. The most unsettling element, however, was the deliberate involvement of children. Boys and girls were brought to witness these events as if attending a school lesson. They stood in the front rows, their small hands clutching stones given by parents or elders. Some accounts suggest that children were even rewarded with sweets or toys for their participation, ensuring that the association between violence and pleasure would be etched into their memories. This was education through horror, conditioning the next generation to see extreme violence not as aberration but as civic duty. By normalizing cruelty at such a young age, society ensured that brutality became part of the cultural fabric. Adults who had grown up cheering at executions carried this callousness into daily life. Domestic abuse, subjugation of women, and the acceptance of hierarchy all found silent reinforcement in the echoes of public punishment. Violence was not only tolerated, it was sanctified. When compared to other punishments of the Greek world, Apotympanismos stands out in its unique cruelty. Other forms of justice, while harsh, were swifter or less humiliating. Catapontismos, ritual drowning, ended life quickly, often in relative privacy, far from the prying eyes of crowds. The pharmakos ritual, where a scapegoat absorbed the city's ills, might involve public spectacle, but usually concluded with exile or a swift death. Only Apotympanismos combined prolonged physical torment with the deliberate destruction of dignity. It was not punishment alone, it was annihilation of both body and soul. The recognition of this horror seeped even into Greek literature. Tragic playwrights such as Sophocles and Euripides alluded to such punishments in their dramas, using them as symbols of ultimate terror. Audiences, accustomed to seeing such events firsthand, reacted with knowing unease when the horrors of public execution were mirrored on stage. The playwrights understood that the fear of dishonor and erasure was greater even than the fear of death itself. Yet despite this cultural awareness, the practice continued. The paradox was chilling: the Greeks knew their punishments were cruel, they acknowledged their brutality, and still they participated. For them, it was both civic ritual and communal theater. The impact on society was profound. Communities that regularly carried out such spectacles became hardened, their sense of empathy dulled. Violence against women was not only normalized but institutionalized. Hierarchies of gender and power were reinforced through public blood and shame, and this system of oppression perpetuated itself generation after generation. Most terrifying of all was what followed death. For many cultures, death marked the end of suffering, a release into whatever lay beyond. But for victims of Apotympanismos, death was only the transition to a deeper form of obliteration. The Greeks refined a post-mortem cruelty, damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory itself. This erasure often began before the condemned had even drawn her final breath. Scribes, working under official orders, carefully scratched names from scrolls, chiseled them from inscriptions, and blotted them from civic records. In some cases, the obliteration was so thorough that modern scholars find only gaps where once a name had stood. These blank spaces testify not to mercy, but to a society determined to ensure that a woman's life, her story, her very existence, vanished from history. Thus the punishment extended beyond the grave, consuming both body and memory. It was not enough to kill. The goal was to unmake, to erase as though she had never lived at all. The punishment of Apotympanismos did not end with the victim's final breath. It extended into the very fabric of memory itself. Once condemned, a woman's name was not simply ignored, it was actively erased. Chisel struck stone, scraping her identity from public monuments. Genealogies that once traced her lineage were deliberately rewritten, with her existence cut away as though it had never been. Even in the sacred rolls of temples, her offerings and dedications were struck from record. To the world she had lived in, she became invisible, an absence so complete that her very life was treated as a contamination to be expunged. The devastation for her surviving family was intentional. Her children, once heirs to property and citizenship, suddenly found their rights questioned. Inheritance disappeared, marriages collapsed before they could be arranged, and the legitimacy of their birth was doubted in every corner of society. The stain of their mother's punishment, what the Greeks called miasma, clung to them like an invisible plague. Every social interaction was poisoned by association, every door closed in their faces. The cruelty deepened in death. Greek belief demanded proper burial as a sacred duty, ensuring peace for the soul and passage to the afterlife. Denying burial meant condemning the soul to wander eternally, restless and unanchored. Bodies left unburied were desecrated by the elements, by animals, and by human neglect. To the ancients, this was a horror beyond imagination, a torment that extended suffering beyond mortal life into eternity itself. Material erasure was equally thorough. Property was confiscated, redistributed among male relatives or claimed by the state. Homes were stripped bare, clothing and personal possessions auctioned, wealth absorbed into the treasury. To the city, this represented practical profit. Symbolically, however, it scattered the last tangible traces of a person's existence to the winds, ensuring that future generations would struggle to reconstruct their life. After death came ritual cleansing. Priests were summoned to purify the sacred spaces once touched by the condemned. Offerings she had made to the gods were burned or broken, temples she had entered were ritually cleansed, and her name was removed from all religious registries. To the community, even the gods themselves were to forget that she had ever drawn breath. Erasure reached heaven as well as earth. Perhaps the most chilling aspect was the forced cultivation of collective amnesia. Communities trained themselves to avoid her name, to erase her story not only from records but from memory. To speak of her risked social contagion, those who mentioned the condemned could themselves be tainted by association, suspected of harboring disloyalty. Silence became a civic duty, and the absence of memory was policed as thoroughly as the original punishment. Archaeological evidence confirms this meticulous destruction. Inscriptions uncovered in Athens, Thebes, and other polis show names carved away so cleanly that only hollow spaces remain. Sometimes curse formulas were inscribed in their place, sealing the erasure with malediction. These blank patches on stone are ghosts of identity, silent testimony to the efficiency with which the Greeks dismantled a human being. When compared to Roman damnatio memoriae, the Greek approach appears even more radical. The Romans often reserved erasure for powerful political figures and carried it out after death. The Greeks, however, wove the destruction of memory into the punishment itself. The condemned woman lived long enough to see her name chiseled away, to know she was vanishing from history before her eyes. Obliteration became part of the sentence, forcing her to witness her own disappearance. The psychological scars reached far beyond the victim. Surviving children grew up marked by trauma, learning that their very existence was contaminated. Some became docile, over-compliant citizens, terrified of stepping outside accepted boundaries. Others nursed resentments that smoldered into acts of defiance years later. Families fractured, households collapsed, and social cohesion cracked under the weight of inherited dishonor. Economically, too, the toll was heavy. Families lost labor, wealth, and legacy. Communities lost future generations to stigma and silence. The marketplace profited in the short term from confiscated goods and public spectacles, but the hidden costs, the erosion of trust, the destruction of families, the normalization of cruelty, were profound. What appeared to strengthen order in fact weakened society from within. In the echoes of Apotympanismos, we see more than an ancient punishment. We glimpse a system designed to annihilate not only an individual but an entire lineage, a whole memory, a voice that would never speak again. These echoes reverberated far beyond Greece, leaving patterns of violence, erasure, and social control that haunted Western civilization for centuries to come. Stand for a moment in the ruins of Athens. The wind moves through the broken marble, whistling between the columns of the Parthenon. Tourists climb the worn steps, taking photos, talking about democracy, about the brilliance of philosophy born here. And yet, if you pause, if you let silence settle, you can almost hear something else beneath the stones. Whispers. The echo of suffering. Because the same city that gave the world Plato and Socrates also gave us punishments so cruel, so refined in their humiliation, that they still disturb us 25 centuries later. This is the paradox of Athens, the light of reason standing side by side with the darkness of cruelty. And that darkness did not die with the city's fall. The Romans borrowed it, adapting the idea of erasure into their own system of damnatio memoriae. Medieval Europe carried it forward in public penance, pillories, and processions of shame. And today, though we like to think ourselves different, the pattern has not vanished. It has only changed form. Scroll through social media and you will see modern echoes of Apotympanismos. Public shaming has become digital. Careers collapse in hours, reputations vanish in days, names disappear from feeds and platforms as if they never existed. The Greeks used wooden planks in public squares. We use algorithms and viral outrage. The tools have changed. The impulse has not. Archaeologists keep uncovering the evidence. Raised platforms cut into stone, drains carved to carry away blood and waste, seating arranged for crowds. These were not hidden executions, they were planned spectacles, as carefully designed as a theater. Even the stones carry scars, inscriptions where names have been cut out so deeply that nothing is left but a hollow wound. These blank spaces remind us, cruelty was systematic. It was part of the architecture. And that may be the most frightening truth of all, that cruelty was never the act of a few monsters, but the work of entire communities. Farmers, merchants, children, mothers. All gathered, all complicit. The Greeks called it miasma, a spiritual pollution that justified treating some lives as disposable. But strip away the religious language, and what remains? Fear. Prejudice. The need to control. And the terrifying willingness of ordinary people to believe that cruelty was not only acceptable but necessary. That is why remembering matters. These are not just old stories. They are warnings. Warnings that civilization is thinner than we think. That beneath our laws, our debates, our polished cities, the same instincts wait, the urge to punish, to erase, to destroy in the name of order. The oppression of women in Athens is not just a chapter in history. It still resonates today. The idea that women were property, that their voices did not count, that their existence was bound to shame and silence, echoes of this survive in laws, in cultures, in systems around the world. We see the pattern repeated in new clothes, but the design is ancient. Perhaps the most chilling realization is this: technology has advanced, but the human heart has not. We have refined the machinery of erasure. We are faster, more efficient, more subtle. A crowd no longer needs to gather in the marketplace to watch someone's humiliation. It can happen in millions of homes at once, on glowing screens. A single post, a viral video, a trending hashtag, and a life can be unmade. So we are left with a question, the same question that hung over Athens thousands of years ago. Have we truly moved beyond these instincts, or have we only dressed them in modern clothes? When we scroll, when we share, when we join the outrage, are we any different from the Athenians who threw stones and laughed at the condemned? The ruins of Athens remind us that greatness and cruelty can coexist. That a people who built temples to wisdom also built stages for humiliation. And if that was true for them, what does it say about us? Because history does not vanish. It lingers in the stones, in the stories, in the shadows. And unless we learn from it, unless we resist the impulse to destroy in the name of justice, we risk walking the same path. The ghosts of Apotympanismos are still with us. They no longer stand in the agora, but they haunt the feeds and screens of our own age. And so, as we look at the broken marble of Athens, we are forced to confront an unsettling truth: human cruelty does not die. It adapts. It survives. And it waits for the moment when fear and anger make us forget our humanity. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and see you in the next videos.